The morning of August 17th, 1945, broke humid and oppressive over Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, southeast of Tokyo. Rear Admiral Takeo Kurita stood in the concrete examination facility, watching as 3 junior engineers carefully extracted components from a 5-inch shell that had failed to detonate when it struck the cruiser Yahagi during the Battle of the Philippine Sea 15 months earlier. The shell had been recovered from the ship's wreckage, preserved in seawater, its secrets intact. Kurita had spent 30 years in the Imperial Japanese Navy, commanding battleships and cruisers, orchestrating complex fleet operations. He understood naval gunnery, fire control systems, the intricate mathematics of ballistics. But what lay before him on that steel examination table defied everything he thought he knew about anti-aircraft warfare. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The shell's nose cone had been removed, revealing a cavity packed with miniaturized components. Glass vacuum tubes, each no larger than a man's thumb, a battery system using liquid electrolyte, a radio transmitter and receiver, impossibly compact, designed to function after being fired from a gun barrel at accelerations exceeding 20,000 times the force of gravity. This wasn't just advanced engineering, this was a fundamental reconception of what was technologically possible. Kurita reached out, his hand hovering over the components but not touching. To witness this device was to confront an uncomfortable truth that Japan's naval leadership had been avoiding since the war turned against them in 1943. America hadn't just outproduced Japan, America had outthought them. The proximity fuse, officially designated variable time fuse by the Americans to conceal its true function, represented one of the most closely guarded secrets of World War II. Development had begun in 1940 when the National Defense Research Committee, working with Section T at the Applied Physics Laboratory, tackled what many engineers considered an impossible problem: create a device that could sense an enemy aircraft's proximity and detonate automatically. Pack that device into an artillery shell already containing 7 pounds of high explosive. Make it small enough to fit in the nose cone of a 5-inch naval gun projectile, just 20 3/4 inches long. Engineer it to survive being fired at 20,000 times normal gravity. Design it to function while spinning at 25,000 revolutions per minute. And accomplish all of this in an era before transistors or integrated circuits, using only vacuum tube technology from the 1930s. The British had explored proximity fuse concepts as early as 1939, developing radio-based systems for bombs and rockets. But their designs could withstand only 100 gravities of acceleration, far too fragile for artillery use. The Germans had researched proximity fuses since the early 1930s, exploring acoustic triggers, electrostatic sensors, and radio systems. By 1945, German engineers had developed perhaps 30 to 50 different proximity fuse designs. None ever reached operational deployment. The technical challenges proved insurmountable given Germany's industrial constraints and increasingly desperate strategic situation. Japan had also pursued proximity fuse development, though later and with fewer resources. By 1944, Japanese engineers at the Kamegakubi Naval Proving Ground had created a photoelectric proximity fuse for aerial bombs. The device used a pulsing light source and detector, triggered when the bomb approached close enough to a surface target that reflected light exceeded a predetermined threshold. It was ingenious given Japan's limited miniaturized electronics and capability. But photoelectric fuses only functioned in daylight. They malfunctioned if they detected the sun directly. They couldn't be used in artillery shells due to the extreme firing forces. And by the time Japanese engineers had solved even these limited problems, American B-29s were reducing Japanese industrial capacity to rubble, making mass production impossible. America's achievement wasn't just solving individual technical problems. It was solving all of them simultaneously, while creating an industrial system capable of mass-producing an impossibly complex device. By September 1942, after intensive development at Section T, the first proximity fuzzes emerged from Crosley Corporation's production lines. 5 companies ultimately manufactured fuses, 87 firms contributed components, 110 factories participated in some phase of production. The workers, 90% of them women selected for their nimble fingers and attention to detail, assembled devices containing approximately 130 miniaturized electronic parts. They worked under armed guard, prohibited from discussing their work, unaware they were building one of the war's most decisive weapons. By war's end, American industry had produced over 22 million proximity fuzzes at a cost exceeding $1 billion in 1940s currency, roughly $15 billion in modern terms. The first combat test occurred on January 5, 1943, near Guadalcanal. 4 Japanese Aichi dive bombers attacked a U.S. Navy task force operating off Cape Hunter. One bomb damaged the New Zealand cruiser Achilles before the attack group broke off. As the aircraft departed, Lieutenant Red Cochran, commanding the aft 5-inch battery aboard the cruiser USS Helena, ordered a brief barrage. 3 shells. Minimal time to aim. All 3 exploded near one of the withdrawing dive bombers. The aircraft, damaged by shrapnel from shells that never directly contacted it, crashed into the sea. Rear Admiral William Halsey, reviewing the action report, understood immediately that naval warfare had fundamentally changed. Throughout 1943, American naval forces in the Pacific received increasingly large allocations of proximity-fused ammunition. The weapon's effectiveness was staggering. Although only 25% of anti-aircraft ammunition issued to the fleet used proximity fuses, those shells accounted for 50% of all Japanese aircraft shot down by naval gunfire. The fuse was 300% more effective than conventional timed or contact fuses. By 1945, effectiveness had increased to nearly 600%, despite a 30% dud rate from early production issues. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who commanded destroyer forces in the Solomon Islands, later described the transformation. Mechanical time fuses, Burke recalled, brought down aircraft at night only by accident. They were useful for harassment but ineffective as actual weapons. With proximity fuses, the equation reversed. Aircraft that approached American task forces entered kill zones where nearly invisible radio waves detected their presence, triggering airbursts that saturated the sky with shrapnel. The weapon's secrecy was maintained through strict deployment protocols. Initially, proximity fuses were restricted to over-ocean use, ensuring dud shells would fall into deep water beyond enemy recovery. The weapon was deceptively named Variable Time Fuse to suggest it was merely an improved mechanical timing device. American forces were instructed never to use the fuses where they might be captured. These protocols held until December 1944, when General Dwight Eisenhower, facing the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, demanded access to proximity-fused artillery shells for land warfare. 200,000 shells, codenamed POSIT, were rushed to Europe. Their effect on German infantry and formations was devastating. Shells programmed to detonate 30 to 50 feet above ground created airbursts that trenches couldn't protect against. Fragments penetrated log-reinforced revetments. German casualties in the Battle of the Bulge increased catastrophically. But in the Pacific, Japan experienced the weapon's full fury. By early 1944, as American forces advanced across the Central Pacific, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire had made conventional Japanese bombing and torpedo attacks increasingly suicidal. Loss rates exceeded sustainable levels. The percentage of hits achieved by even experienced Japanese pilots dropped into single digits. Tactics had to adapt. The result was the kamikaze. When proximity fuses were introduced, attacking aircraft might break off if met with effective anti-aircraft fire. But kamikaze pilots pressed attacks to impact regardless of defensive fire. The weapon had contributed to creating an even more desperate enemy tactic. Yet, even against kamikazes, proximity fuses proved effective. The shells didn't need direct hits. They only needed to pass close enough to detonate, filling the air with shrapnel that could damage aircraft sufficiently to knock them off trajectory or destroy control surfaces. At Okinawa in 1945, where Japan launched thousands of kamikaze attacks, American ships equipped with proximity-fused ammunition had significantly better survival rates than those relying on conventional anti-aircraft fire alone. Back in the Yokosuka examination facility, Admiral Kurita continued his inspection. The engineers had now fully disassembled the American shell. Components lay arranged on white cloth like artifacts from an advanced civilization. Kurita picked up one of the miniaturized vacuum tubes. It weighed almost nothing. Glass envelope no thicker than paper. Internal elements precisely aligned. The tube had survived being fired from a gun barrel, survived spinning at 25,000 rotations per minute. Functioned for the few seconds necessary to detect a target and trigger detonation. Commander Jiro Nomura, the facility's technical director, stood beside the examination table with a thick folder. Nomura had graduated from Tokyo Imperial University in 1933 with highest honors in electrical engineering. Before the war, he'd studied radio theory, vacuum tube design, circuit miniaturization. The folder contained his preliminary analysis, 16 pages of technical drawings and calculations. "Your assessment?" Kurita asked quietly. Admiral, this device represents integration of at least 6 distinct technological advances we have not achieved. First, miniaturization of vacuum tubes to this scale, while maintaining reliability under extreme mechanical stress. Our vacuum tubes can be ruggedized. We developed metal-cased designs by 1938, but ours fail under artillery acceleration forces. Second, the battery system. The Americans use a liquid electrolyte design that arms only after the shell is fired. Centrifugal force from the shell's rotation pushes the electrolyte against metal contacts, generating electrical current. It's elegant, fail-safe, impossible to accidentally detonate during handling. The radio transmitter-receiver circuit. They've created a Doppler radar system small enough to fit here. He gestured at the shell's nose cone cavity. That operates effectively for only a few seconds, but does so reliably in the electromagnetic environment of an artillery barrage. Fourth, signal processing. The device must distinguish between genuine targets and false returns, must function despite the shell's violent rotation, must trigger detonation at precisely the correct range. Fifth, manufacturing precision. Every component must be made to tolerances we cannot consistently achieve in mass production. And sixth, most importantly, they've created an industrial system capable of producing these devices by the millions. Nomura paused, choosing his next words carefully. Admiral, individual elements of this technology we theoretically understand. We know Doppler radar principles. We can build vacuum tubes. But we cannot integrate all these elements into a functional device, this small, this reliable, under these performance requirements. And even if we could build one experimentally, we lack the industrial capacity to manufacture them at scale. Kurita absorbed this assessment in silence. Around the examination room, other engineers were documenting components with cameras, taking precise measurements, creating technical drawings. All of this would be compiled into reports that would be read by what few naval officers remained in positions of authority. Japan had surrendered 2 days earlier. This examination was now an exercise in understanding why they had lost, not in finding methods to win. "How far behind would you estimate we are?" Kurita finally asked. Nomura considered the question. It was the question Kurita had been avoiding asking explicitly. The question that made defeat not just a matter of lost battles, but of fundamental technological inadequacy. In vacuum tube miniaturization, Nomura began, we are perhaps 5 to 6 years behind. We could develop similar tubes given time and resources. In circuit design and radio engineering, perhaps 4 years. In battery technology, perhaps 3 years. But in industrial integration, in the ability to translate laboratory prototypes into mass-produced, reliable systems, Nomura paused. Admiral, in that capability, we are 8 to 10 years behind. Perhaps more. This gap isn't merely technical. It's philosophical. It represents a different approach to warfare, to engineering, to the relationship between scientific research and military production. Kurita set down the vacuum tube with care that bordered on reverence. Behind him, through the facility's windows, he could see the devastation American B-29 raids had inflicted on Yokosuka. Entire buildings reduced to skeletal frames, cranes toppled, dry docks cratered. The great naval arsenal that had built battleships and cruisers for the Imperial Navy was now rubble. "Tell me about our attempts to develop similar weapons," Kurita said. Nomura flipped through his folder to a different section. "We began serious proximity fuse research in late 1943, after reports from naval aviators indicated the Americans possessed a weapon of this type. Initial efforts focused on radar-based systems similar to what you see here, but we encountered immediate problems. Our vacuum tube manufacturers couldn't produce tubes capable of surviving artillery acceleration. Even when we developed more robust designs, the tubes were too large to fit in shell nose cones alongside necessary explosive charges. By mid-1944, we shifted to alternative approaches. The photoelectric fuse for aerial bombs was our most successful attempt. It was deployed experimentally on one occasion, a 155mm anti-aircraft gun defending Tokyo. Reports suggest it successfully engaged a B-29 at 30,000 feet, but the system required perfect visibility, failed in clouds or at night, and we never manufactured enough units for operational significance. Nomura turned another page. We also explored acoustic proximity fuses triggered by aircraft engine sound. These proved even more difficult. Background noise from the shell's own flight, from other explosions, from ground reflection, created too many false signals. We researched magnetic sensors, electrostatic field detection, even infrared systems. All encountered insurmountable technical or practical limitations. The fundamental problem, Nomura continued, wasn't lack of theoretical knowledge. Japanese engineers understood the principles. The problem was execution at scale under wartime constraints. By 1944, American strategic bombing had crippled our precision manufacturing capability. Raw material shortages made even basic production impossible. Skilled workers were conscripted into infantry units or died in air raids. Industrial coordination collapsed. Even if we had solved every technical challenge, we lacked the infrastructure to produce proximity fuses in meaningful numbers. Kurita walked to the window, staring out at the destroyed arsenal. "A different question, then," he said. "When did we lose? When did this war become unwinnable?" Nomura understood that Kurita wasn't asking about specific battles or strategic decisions. He was asking about the deeper asymmetry, the technological and industrial imbalance that had doomed Japan from the beginning. "The question is difficult to answer precisely," Nomura replied carefully. "If you mean when did American technological superiority become evident, I would say early 1943, when proximity fuses first appeared in combat. If you mean when did that superiority become decisive, perhaps mid-1944, when the combination of advanced weapons, industrial capacity, and improved tactics made our continued resistance futile from a purely military standpoint. But if you ask when the war became truly unwinnable," Nomura paused. "Admiral, I believe it was unwinnable from the moment we attacked Pearl Harbor. We challenged a nation with 10 times our industrial capacity, vast natural resources, technological sophistication we couldn't match, and an educational system producing engineers and scientists in numbers we couldn't approach. This proximity fuse is merely one example of a broader pattern. They developed better radar, better fire control systems, better cryptographic security, better logistics, better everything. We excelled at individual acts of courage, at tactical brilliance, at martial spirit. They excelled at systematic thinking, industrial organization, technological innovation. War is decided by the latter, not the former." The room fell silent except for the soft sounds of engineers documenting components. Kurita remained at the window for a long moment before turning back to the examination table. "Include all of this in your final report," he instructed. "Be honest about the technological gap, about our failures, about the implications for future military planning. If Japan is to rebuild, we must understand why we lost completely and truthfully, without self-deception or face-saving rhetoric. Engineers must speak truth even when that truth is painful. Nomura nodded. He understood the significance of what Kurita was authorizing. Japanese military culture traditionally emphasized success, valor, victory through spiritual strength. To document systematic technological inferiority, to admit the enemy had simply outthought and out-engineered them, contradicted decades of institutional culture. But Kurita was correct. Truth was the first requirement of rebuilding. Over the following weeks, as the American occupation established control over Japan, Nomura's team completed their examination. They documented every component of the proximity fuse, created detailed technical drawings, wrote comprehensive analyses comparing American and Japanese capabilities. The report, eventually compiled into 48 pages with extensive appendices, became one of several hundred documents produced by Japanese technical experts under supervision of the U.S. Naval Technical Mission to Japan. American investigators, arriving in September 1945, systematically surveyed Japanese naval technology. Captain Clifford Grimes, commanding the mission, led 655 officers and men across the home islands. They entered Tokyo, Yokohama, Kure, Hiroshima, Osaka, Nagoya. They examined factories, arsenals, laboratories, shipyards. They interrogated engineers, scientists, military commanders. They compiled 185 separate reports evaluating every aspect of Japanese naval capability. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What emerged from these investigations was a comprehensive picture of Japanese technological development, revealing both remarkable achievements and critical shortcomings. The Japanese had built the world's largest battleships, Yamato and Musashi, engineering marvels mounting 18-inch guns. They'd developed the Long Lance torpedo, longer-ranged and more powerful than any American equivalent. They'd created the Zero fighter, which in 1941 outperformed every Allied aircraft in the Pacific. But these successes masked systemic weaknesses in industrial integration, mass production capability, and technological adaptability. Japan's military procurement emphasized perfection over practicality, quality over quantity, sophisticated design over sustainable manufacture. The proximity fuse crystallized this difference. Where American engineers had designed for mass production from the outset, Japanese engineers pursued theoretical perfection without adequate consideration for manufacturing constraints. Where American industry could produce 70,000 fuses daily by war's end, Japanese industry struggled to produce even prototype quantities of simpler weapons. Where American logistics delivered 22 million fuses to combat units across 2 oceans, Japanese logistics couldn't adequately supply forces defending the home islands. Rear Admiral Kurita's involvement in the proximity fuse examination was among his final official acts. Born in 1889, Kurita had entered the Naval Academy in 1905, participated in the Battle of Tsushima in Japan's war against Russia, risen through peacetime ranks to command cruiser divisions, and eventually battleship forces. In October 1944, he'd commanded the center force at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement of the Pacific War. His controversial decision to withdraw after coming within striking distance of vulnerable American escort carriers had been debated ever since. Some called it prudent given the tactical situation, others considered it a failure of will at the decisive moment. Now, examining American technology in defeat, Kurita perhaps understood that Leyte Gulf's outcome had been predetermined by factors beyond tactical decisions. American industrial capacity had ensured that every Japanese ship sunk was irreplaceable, while American losses could be made good within months. American technological sophistication meant Japanese forces fought at systematic disadvantage in electronics, fire control, communications, logistics. American operational doctrine emphasized combined arms coordination that Japanese doctrine couldn't match. Leyte Gulf wasn't lost because Kurita withdrew. It was lost because Japan was fighting a war it couldn't win against an enemy it couldn't match. The Proximity Fuse Examination Report reached its conclusion in late September 1945. Commander Nomura submitted it simultaneously to Japanese naval authorities and to American investigators. His conclusions were stark. The proximity fuse represents a technological achievement Japan could not replicate during the war years. The gap between American and Japanese capability in miniaturized electronics, precision manufacturing, and industrial integration rendered proximity fuses effectively impossible for Japan to develop at scale. This technological disparity extended across multiple weapon systems and represented a fundamental weakness in Japanese military capability. Future Japanese defense planning must acknowledge these limitations and develop strategies appropriate to Japan's actual industrial and technological capacity rather than aspirations unsupported by resources. American analysts studying Nomura's report recognized its value. Unlike German technical assessments, which often emphasized theoretical superiority of German designs despite battlefield failures, the Japanese report was unflinchingly honest about Japan's technological limitations. It acknowledged American achievements without excuses or rationalizations. It analyzed failure as engineers analyzing a problem, seeking understanding rather than blame. Captain Grimes included Nomura's proximity fuse assessment in his mission's summary report, noting that Japanese engineers had demonstrated remarkable scientific understanding even as their industrial base collapsed around them. The tragedy of Japanese technology, Grimes wrote, was not lack of knowledge but lack of resources and industrial capability to translate knowledge into operational weapons. By November 1945, the U.S. Naval Technical Mission to Japan had largely completed its work. Reports were compiled, documents shipped to the United States, key Japanese scientists and engineers interviewed extensively. The mission's findings would influence American military procurement and doctrine for decades, but perhaps more importantly, they provided Japan's post-war leaders with an honest assessment of why they had lost. The proximity fuse, in this context, became emblematic of a larger truth. Wars in the industrial age were won not by martial valor or tactical brilliance alone, though both remained important. They were won by nations capable of integrating scientific research, industrial production, technological innovation, and military operations into coherent systems. The side that mastered this integration possessed overwhelming advantage. The side that failed to master it, regardless of courage or determination, faced inevitable defeat. Admiral Kurita never spoke publicly about his examination of the proximity fuse. In the months following Japan's surrender, as American occupation authorities restructured Japanese society, Kurita withdrew from public life. He settled in a modest home in Kobe, declining requests for interviews, refusing to write memoirs that might glorify Japan's failed war effort. Those who knew him in those final years reported that he spent considerable time reading technical journals, studying industrial engineering, contemplating the lessons Japan should have learned but hadn't until too late. In 1949, a young Japanese engineering student named Hideki Watanabe traveled to Kobe to interview Kurita for a university thesis on Japanese naval technology during the war. Kurita initially refused, but Watanabe's persistence eventually earned him a brief meeting. Years later, Watanabe would recall that conversation in his own memoirs. The admiral, then 60 years old, had received him in a small study lined with books on metallurgy, electronics, industrial production, not the military histories Watanabe had expected, but engineering texts, some in English acquired from American military bookshops. Watanabe had asked what Kurita considered the most important lesson of the war. The admiral had thought for a long moment before answering. "We believed," Kurita said, "that spirit could overcome material advantage, that superior training, better tactics, greater willingness to sacrifice, could defeat an enemy with more ships, more planes, more weapons." This was fundamentally wrong. In modern warfare, industrial capacity determines outcomes more decisively than courage. Technology multiplies force more effectively than training. Systematic thinking defeats individual brilliance. We learned this lesson at terrible cost. Young people like yourself must ensure Japan never forgets it. Watanabe had then asked about specific technologies that illustrated this principle. Kurita had walked to a shelf, removed a folder, and shown Watanabe technical drawings of the proximity fuse he'd examined in August 1945. This device, Kurita explained, represented everything we failed to understand about modern war. It wasn't one brilliant invention. It was the integration of multiple technologies, refined through systematic development, manufactured through coordinated industrial effort, deployed through effective logistics. The Americans didn't succeed because they were more intelligent than Japanese engineers. They succeeded because they organized intelligence more effectively. They created systems where we created individual solutions. The proximity fuse's impact extended far beyond its direct military effectiveness. The weapon had forced Japan to adopt increasingly desperate tactics as conventional attacks became suicidal against American anti-aircraft defenses. The kamikaze, while inflicting significant damage on American forces, represented a fundamental admission of technological defeat. When your aircraft cannot survive long enough to deliver weapons conventionally, the aircraft itself becomes the weapon. When your pilots cannot expect to return from missions regardless of skill, training becomes simplified to basic flight and navigation. When your industrial capacity cannot replace losses, human life becomes expendable in ways material cannot be. At Okinawa, from April through June 1945, Japan launched approximately 2,000 kamikaze attacks. American losses were grievous: 21 ships sunk, 66 damaged, thousands of casualties. But Japanese losses were staggering. Nearly 4,000 aircraft destroyed, an equivalent number of pilots killed. The exchange rate, measured in resources expended versus damage inflicted, favored the side with greater industrial capacity. America could absorb losses and rebuild. Japan could not. Proximity fuses didn't prevent all kamikaze successes, but they significantly reduced kamikaze effectiveness compared to conventional anti-aircraft fire. Ships equipped with proximity-fused ammunition had measurably better survival rates. The weapon's existence also influenced American strategic planning. Had the invasion of Japan proceeded, proximity-fused artillery would have been employed extensively against defensive positions. The airbursts that had devastated German infantry in Europe would have been used against Japanese defenders. Combined with other technological advantages, American planners estimated that proximity fuses would have reduced American casualties during the invasion, though the carnage on both sides would still have been immense. The atomic bomb rendered invasion unnecessary, but the proximity fuse had already demonstrated how technological superiority could tilt the calculus of warfare. In the immediate post-war years, as Japan rebuilt under American occupation, the lessons of technological inadequacy influenced reconstruction policy. The Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, General Douglas MacArthur, recognized that Japan's industrial and scientific capabilities, if redirected toward peaceful purposes, could contribute to regional stability. The occupation encouraged development of Japanese electronics industry, precision manufacturing, quality control methodologies. Many engineers who had worked on military projects transitioned to civilian production. The skills that had been insufficient for war proved remarkably effective for peace. Commander Jiro Nomura, whose technical report on the proximity fuse had been so brutally honest, became a professor at Tokyo Institute of Technology in 1948. He taught courses on electronics, precision manufacturing, and systems engineering. His lectures often referenced the proximity fuse as a case study in successful technological integration. American engineers, Nomura would tell his students, succeeded not through individual genius, but through systematic collaboration between researchers, manufacturers, military users. They created feedback loops where field experience informed design improvements, where production challenges drove simplified engineering, where every component was optimized for the overall system rather than individual performance. One of Nomura's students, Akio Morita, would later co-found Sony Corporation, helping transform Japan into a global electronics powerhouse. Another, Masaru Ibuka, became Sony's co-founder alongside Morita, These men, and others like them, absorbed lessons about miniaturization, quality control, manufacturing precision that had been learned through military defeat. They applied those lessons to consumer electronics, creating products that eventually dominated world markets. The technological gap that had doomed Japan in war became a challenge to overcome in peace, driving innovation that would define Japan's post-war economic miracle. The proximity fuse itself continued evolving after World War II. The principles developed for the VT fuse influenced subsequent weapons development, from guided missiles to modern air defense systems. The miniaturization techniques pioneered to fit electronics into 5-inch shells presaged the transistor revolution of the 1950s and the integrated circuit revolution of the 1960s. The manufacturing methodologies that produced 22 million fuzzes during the war informed American industrial production for decades. The weapon that had been a closely guarded secret became, after its public revelation in September 1945, a symbol of American technological achievement. But for Japan, the proximity fuse remained a symbol of something different. The cost of technological hubris, the danger of believing spirit could substitute for systematic thinking, the price of inadequate integration between scientific research and industrial production. These lessons influenced Japanese business culture profoundly. Post-war Japanese corporations emphasized continuous improvement, systematic quality control, manufacturing excellence, close collaboration between engineers and production workers. The Toyota production system, developed in the 1950s, embodied principles of systematic efficiency that American industry had demonstrated during the war. The focus on precision and reliability that characterized post-war Japanese manufacturing reflected hard lessons learned when precision and reliability had been matters of national survival. In 1953, Admiral Kurita died quietly in Kobe at age 64. His obituaries noted his service in the Imperial Navy, his command at Leyte Gulf, his controversial withdrawal that had been debated for years. Few mentioned his post-war work examining captured American technology or his efforts to ensure Japan understood why it had lost. But among Japanese engineers and military historians, Kurita's insistence on honest technological assessment was remembered. He had refused to participate in face-saving narratives that attributed defeat to bad luck, strategic errors, or American material superiority alone. He had insisted Japan acknowledge that American military success reflected superior systematic thinking, better integration of technology and tactics, more effective translation of scientific knowledge into operational weapons. The examination facility at Yokosuka, where Kurita had studied the proximity fuse in August 1945, was demolished during post-war reconstruction. The reports generated there, including Commander Nomura's detailed technical assessment, were preserved in American and Japanese archives. Historians studying the Pacific War would later reference these documents as examples of defeated combatants honestly confronting their failures. Unlike some German assessments that emphasized theoretical superiority of German technology despite battlefield defeats, the Japanese reports acknowledged American achievements forthrightly. By 1960, 15 years after the war's end, Japan had transformed from devastated ruins to emerging economic power. The industrial capacity that had proven inadequate for sustaining warfare proved remarkably effective for peaceful production. Japanese electronics companies began exporting transistor radios, televisions, tape recorders. Japanese automobile manufacturers started producing vehicles that combined reliability with efficiency. Japanese steel mills and shipyards rebuilt to scales exceeding their wartime capacity. The nation that had been 8 to 10 years behind America in critical technologies was rapidly closing gaps and, in some areas, beginning to surpass American capabilities. This transformation reflected lessons learned through defeat. Japanese industry emphasized quality control with an intensity born from understanding that unreliable weapons meant battlefield failure. Japanese manufacturers focused on production efficiency learned from studying how America had built tanks, ships, aircraft, and proximity fuzzes by the millions. Japanese corporations invested heavily in research and development, recognizing that technological innovation determined competitive success. The proximity fuse, in its way, had taught Japan that modern competition, whether military or economic, demanded systematic excellence across entire production chains. There's a footnote to this story that emerged decades later through declassified documents. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, German forces captured an American ammunition dump containing 20,000 proximity fuses for artillery shells. German intelligence officers, examining these fuses, faced the same revelation Japanese engineers would experience months later. The device's sophistication, its miniaturized electronics, its brilliant engineering, confronted them with uncomfortable truth about technological disparities. German engineers had previously concluded that proximity fuses were impossible given the acceleration forces during firing. Their assessment wasn't wrong based on their technological capabilities, but they had assumed their limitations were universal. Seeing American fuses forced German engineers to recognize that America had solved problems Germany considered unsolvable. The captured fuses were analyzed extensively, but Germany lacked time, resources, and industrial capacity to replicate them. The war ended before German engineers could translate understanding into operational weapons. This parallel experience, German and Japanese engineers simultaneously confronting the same American technological achievement, highlighted how far the Axis powers had fallen behind in critical military technologies. Both Germany and Japan had entered the war confident in their engineering capabilities, certain their tactical brilliance and martial spirit would compensate for American material advantages. Both discovered too late that modern industrial warfare rewarded systematic thinking over individual excellence, reliable production over sophisticated design, sustainable logistics over brilliant innovation. The proximity fuse wasn't the only technology where this pattern manifested. American radar was more reliable and more widely deployed than German or Japanese equivalents. American cryptography was more secure. American fire control systems were more accurate. American logistics was more efficient. American industrial production was more massive. Each individual advantage might have been overcome. The cumulative weight of systematic superiority across multiple domains proved decisive. In 1978, the Applied Physics Laboratory, which had developed the proximity fuse under Section T during the war, held a symposium commemorating the weapon's 35th anniversary. Several Japanese engineers attended, including former Commander Nomura, then 72 years old, and Professor Emeritus at Tokyo Institute of Technology. During the symposium, Nomura presented a paper titled Lessons in Technological Integration, Japanese Perspectives on the VT Fuse. The paper, later published in technical journals, analyzed why Japan had failed to develop equivalent technology. Nomura identified several factors beyond simple industrial capacity. First, insufficient integration between military requirements and engineering development. Japanese military authorities often specified weapon characteristics without consulting engineers about feasibility. Second, inadequate testing and refinement cycles. Japanese weapons were often rushed to production without the iterative improvement that American systems underwent. Third, poor coordination between component manufacturers. Where American production involved hundreds of specialized firms working to exact specifications, Japanese production relied on fewer manufacturers with less precise coordination. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, cultural reluctance to acknowledge limitations. American engineers freely admitted when designs failed, modified approaches, tried alternative solutions. Japanese engineers faced pressure to succeed with initial designs, making iterative improvement difficult. This cultural factor, Nomura argued, had proven as significant as material constraints. Honest assessment of failure enabled faster progress toward success. Pride that prevented acknowledging failure guaranteed repeated failure. The symposium audience, including American veterans who had worked on proximity fuse development, received Nomura's presentation with respect. After decades, former enemies could discuss technical achievements without rancor. The proximity fuse had been a weapon of war, but it had also been a triumph of systematic engineering. Japanese engineers could appreciate that achievement even while regretting its effectiveness against their nation. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who had commanded destroyers in the Solomon Islands and witnessed proximity fuses' combat effectiveness firsthand, attended the symposium. Now retired, Burke spoke briefly during the question period following Nomura's presentation. He noted that proximity fuses had saved countless American lives, made anti-aircraft defense vastly more effective, contributed significantly to Allied victory. But Burke also acknowledged that the weapons development had benefited from Britain's early research, from feedback from combat usage, from America's unique industrial advantages. No single nation, Burke suggested, possessed monopoly on innovation. What America had achieved was creating systems that translated innovation into operational capability more effectively than its enemies. This recognition of systematic factors, rather than inherent superiority, represented evolution in how American military professionals understood their World War II victories. Initial post-war narratives had emphasized American technological genius, industrial might, military prowess. Later analysis acknowledged that American success reflected specific historical circumstances. Geographic isolation from enemy attack, vast natural resources, established industrial base, educational system producing engineers and scientists in large numbers, political system enabling coordination between government, military, and private industry. Japan had lacked several of these advantages. The home islands possessed few natural resources, requiring imports of oil, iron, rubber, other critical materials. The industrial base, while sophisticated, operated at scale insufficient for protracted conflict. The education system, though producing capable engineers, could not match American output. Most critically, strategic geography placed Japan within range of American bomber attack, enabling the systematic destruction of industrial capacity that made late-war weapons development impossible. Understanding these contextual factors didn't diminish American achievements, but placed them in proper perspective. The proximity fuse succeeded because talented engineers solved difficult problems through systematic effort, supported by enormous industrial resources, operating in secure facilities beyond enemy reach, producing for military users who provided feedback enabling continuous improvement. Remove any of these elements and development might have failed or produced inferior results. For Japan, the proximity fuse's legacy extended beyond technology into philosophy. The weapon symbolized the danger of fighting wars your industrial base cannot sustain, pursuing military objectives your technological capacity cannot support, believing martial valor can substitute for systematic preparation. These lessons influenced post-war Japanese policy profoundly. Japan's post-war constitution renounced war, constraining military spending, requiring Japan to focus resources on economic rather than military competition. This constitutional framework, imposed initially by American occupation but retained by Japanese choice, reflected understanding that Japan's future depended on peaceful competition, where systematic organization and technological innovation could flourish without the waste of warfare. By the early 21st century, Japan had become the world's second or third largest economy, a global leader in electronics, automobiles, precision manufacturing, robotics. The nation that had been 8 to 10 years behind America in critical technologies during World War II had not only closed that gap, but, in many fields, established technological leadership. Sony, Honda, Toyota, Panasonic, Canon, Nikon, Mitsubishi companies built in the post-war era embodied systematic excellence, quality focus, manufacturing precision that reflected lessons learned through military defeat. The engineers who examined the proximity fuse in August 1945, who documented Japan's technological shortcomings with painful honesty, who insisted their nation confront uncomfortable truths, contributed to this transformation. They established precedent that honest assessment of failure enabled improvement. They demonstrated that acknowledging an enemy's achievements didn't diminish one's own value, but provided foundation for learning. They showed that systematic thinking, collaborative effort, and industrial integration determined outcomes more decisively than individual brilliance. On August 17, 2020, exactly 75 years after Admiral Kurita examined the captured proximity fuse, a memorial ceremony was held at the site of the former Yokosuka examination facility. The ceremony commemorated not the weapon itself, but the lessons it represented. Japanese and American veterans, now in their 90s, attended alongside engineers, historians, students. Speakers emphasized how former enemies had become close allies, how technological competition had shifted from military to economic spheres, how honest confrontation with past failures had enabled future success. Among the attendees was Professor Kenji Nomura, grandson of Commander Jiro Nomura, who had written the 1945 technical assessment. The younger Nomura had followed his grandfather into electrical engineering, eventually teaching at the same Tokyo Institute of Technology, where his grandfather had been Professor Emeritus. In remarks at the ceremony, Professor Nomura quoted from his grandfather's 1978 symposium paper, "The proximity fuse taught us that wars are won by systems, not weapons, by organizations, not individuals, by sustained effort, not brilliant inspiration." These lessons, learned through defeat, became foundation for Japan's peaceful prosperity. We honor the weapon not for its destructive power but for the truth it revealed. The ceremony concluded with moment of silence for all who died in the Pacific War, Japanese and American, military and civilian. Then attendees toured a small museum that had been established at the site, displaying replica components of proximity fuses, technical drawings, historical documents, photographs of wartime production. One exhibit featured Commander Nomura's original 1945 report, its pages yellowed but text still clear, documenting with engineering precision the technological gap that had contributed to Japan's defeat. Another exhibit showed the progression of Japanese electronics from the post-war years through the present, illustrating how the nation that had been unable to manufacture proximity fuses in wartime had become a global leader in miniaturized electronics, precision manufacturing, quality control. The exhibit made explicit connection between lessons learned and achievements realized. Defeat had taught humility, systematic thinking, honest self-assessment. These qualities, applied to peaceful competition, had proven more valuable than the pride, overconfidence, and self-deception that had contributed to wartime failure. As the ceremony ended and attendees dispersed, an elderly man remained standing before the display of proximity fuse components. He was 96 years old, one of the junior engineers who had assisted in the August 1945 examination. His name was Takeshi Yamada, and he had been 21 that day, fresh from technical college, assigned to document components with camera and measuring instruments. He had watched Admiral Kurita hold the miniaturized vacuum tube, had heard Commander Nomura explain the 8 to 10 year technological gap, had seen the defeated resignation in older officers' faces. A young reporter approached Yamada, asking what he remembered most clearly from that day 75 years earlier. Yamada thought for a long moment before answering. "I remember the silence," he finally said. After Commander Nomura explained how far behind we were, there was this profound silence. Not the silence of surrender, we had already surrendered, but the silence of understanding. We had believed we were fighting with courage against an enemy with more resources. That day we learned we had been fighting with obsolete methods against an enemy who thought differently than we did. That understanding was more devastating than any battlefield defeat. The reporter asked if Yamada had felt anger toward the Americans for possessing such overwhelming technological advantages. Yamada shook his head slowly. "No anger," he replied. "Perhaps relief. If you must lose a war, better to lose to an enemy whose superiority reflects systematic excellence rather than mere numbers. The proximity fuse showed us that America had outthought us, not just outproduced us. That meant we could learn from them. And we did. Everything I did in my career afterward, 40 years designing electronics for civilian use, was informed by lessons learned examining that device. We learned to think systematically, to integrate components into systems, to design for manufacturing, to test rigorously, to acknowledge failures quickly. These lessons, learned from American engineering, became Japanese engineering practice. This, perhaps, was the proximity fuse's most lasting legacy for Japan. Not the weapon's destructive power, though that had been significant. Not even the specific technologies it embodied, though those influenced subsequent development. But the lesson it taught about systematic thinking, about integration of research and production, about honest assessment of capabilities, about the relationship between technological sophistication and military effectiveness. These lessons, learned in the bitter crucible of defeat, shaped post-war Japan profoundly. The proximity fuse that Admiral Kurita examined in August 1945 no longer exists. It was either destroyed during subsequent examination or lost in the chaos of occupation. But the reports generated from its examination survived, preserved in archives, studied by historians, referenced in engineering curricula. Commander Nomura's 48-page technical assessment, with its brutal honesty about Japanese limitations and American achievements, remained one of the most cited documents from the U.S. Naval Technical Mission to Japan. In its pages, future generations could read how Japanese engineers confronted defeat not with excuses or rationalizations, but with scientific objectivity. They measured, they analyzed, they calculated exactly how far behind they had fallen and why. They documented American achievements with the same precision they documented Japanese failures. This intellectual honesty, rare among defeated militaries, provided foundation for post-war reconstruction. Japan couldn't rebuild effectively while deceiving itself about why it had lost. Truth was prerequisite to learning. Learning was prerequisite to improvement. On that August morning in 1945, standing in the Yokosuka examination facility, Admiral Kurita had held in his hand a device that represented everything Japan had failed to achieve: miniaturized electronics, systematic engineering, industrial integration, reliable mass production, technologies Japan's scientists understood theoretically but couldn't translate into operational weapons. The gap of 8 to 10 years that Commander Nomura identified wasn't merely technical. It reflected deeper differences in how societies organized scientific knowledge, industrial capability, military requirements into coherent systems. America had created such systems. Japan had not. This asymmetry, more than any single battle or strategic decision, determined the war's outcome. The proximity fuse didn't win the war alone. No single weapon ever does. But it symbolized the systematic superiority that made American victory inevitable once industrial mobilization reached full strength. It represented the triumph of organized intelligence over individual brilliance, sustainable production over sophisticated design, systematic thinking over tactical excellence. These lessons, learned through examining captured technology in the aftermath of defeat, influenced not just Japan but military establishments worldwide. The proximity fuse demonstrated that modern warfare rewarded integration as much as innovation, systems as much as weapons, organization as much as courage. Nations that mastered this integration held decisive advantages. Nations that failed to master it, regardless of tactical skill or individual heroism, fought at systematic disadvantage. 75 years after Admiral Kurita's examination, the proximity fuse remained a case study in engineering education, military history, industrial organization. Students studied not just how the device worked, but why America succeeded in developing it while Japan and Germany failed. The answers revealed patterns about technological competition, industrial capacity, systematic thinking that remained relevant long after World War II ended. The weapon that had been one of America's most closely guarded secrets became, through Japanese examination and honest assessment, a teacher of lessons that former enemies learned together. Technology could be replicated, weapons could be copied. But systematic thinking, organizational capability, honest self-assessment, these qualities had to be cultivated over time through cultural change. Japan's post-war success reflected willingness to learn these lessons, to abandon practices that had led to defeat, to adopt approaches that American success had demonstrated effective. In the end, the proximity fuse's greatest impact on Japan wasn't destruction it caused during the war, though that had been significant. It was the understanding it created afterward, understanding that modern competition, whether military or economic, demanded excellence across entire systems, not just individual components. Understanding that technological sophistication required integration of research, development, manufacturing, deployment, feedback, refinement. Understanding that honest confrontation with failure enabled faster progress than prideful denial ever could. These understandings, born from examining captured American technology in defeat, became foundations of Japan's post-war transformation. The nation that had been 8 to 10 years behind in critical technologies used that understanding to close gaps, match competitors, eventually establish leadership in numerous fields. The proximity fuse had revealed what was possible through systematic thinking. Japan spent the following decades proving it could master systematic thinking as effectively as any nation. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.